The candles in the Ashford Hall ballroom had been burning for 2 hours when Cecily Hartley laughed. It was not the bright social laugh she deployed for earls and their mothers. It was the quieter one, the one she reserved for moments when no one was watching, or when she believed no one was watching, which amounted, in Cecily's experience, to the same thing. She tilted her head toward Annalise and spoke behind her fan, and her words arrived soft and certain as a closing door. "No one will ever choose you," she said. "You do understand that?" Annalise did not answer. She held her own fan at a measured height and watched the far end of the ballroom, where the Duke of Crestwood stood alone at the terrace doors, with his back to the room, his profile pressed against winter glass, and his stillness so complete that the crowd moved around him the way a river moves around stone. She did not know yet what that stillness cost him. She did not know yet what it would come to mean. She knew only that Cecily was still speaking, and that the gown she wore had been altered from one of Cecily's cast-offs, and that the season had been open for precisely 11 days. What she did not yet know was that in fewer than 4 weeks, the Duke would cross that same ballroom floor for her, and the world would turn on its axis while approximately 60 people watched. Annalise Hartley was 23 years old and had not expected to attend the season at all. Her father, a careful Devonshire gentleman of moderate means and considerable warmth, had died the previous February, leaving behind a house that passed by entail to a cousin she had never met, a library she had been permitted to keep, and 2 daughters for whom the season represented the only remaining machinery of provision. Cecily was 26 and had already spent 2 seasons circling the periphery of a match that kept retreating just beyond reach. Annalise had been brought along because Cecily required a chaperone of the household variety, someone whose presence lent propriety without drawing attention, which was, in Cecily's considered opinion, precisely what Annalise was for. The arrangement was made plain on the carriage journey north. Cecily would occupy the drawing rooms, Annalise would occupy the margins. Cecily would be introduced to persons of consequence. Annalise would be introduced as the sister. The season, Cecily explained in the voice she used when the outcome was not under discussion, was a limited resource, and she intended to use it correctly. The Hartley sisters had arrived at Ashford Hall as guests of Mrs. Pendleton, a distant connection of their mother's, who maintained a house on the estate's eastern border, and who issued invitations with a generosity that occasionally outpaced her means. The hall itself was a great amber-stoned house set in grounds that turned silver at dusk, and its owner, Sir Henry Ashford, had opened it for the first ball of the season with the kind of social confidence that could only be produced by a house held for 6 generations. The guests numbered close to 60 on this first evening, with the promise of more as the fortnight advanced. Edmund Vane, the Duke of Crestwood, had come because Sir Henry had asked him, and because he had not yet learned to refuse invitations efficiently, without giving more offense than the refusal was worth. He was 31 years old, recently confirmed in a title that had passed to him 4 years earlier, when his father died, within the same terrible winter that had taken other things, and he moved through social occasions with a discipline that most of the room read as coldness, and a few read as grief, and none, as yet, had read correctly. He was standing at the terrace doors when Annalise first noticed him, because he was the only person in the room who was not moving. The orchestra was playing a reel, and the floor was bright with satin and emeralds, and the confident sound of people who had been told their whole lives that rooms were arranged for their pleasure. The Duke stood apart from all of it, with his hands clasped behind his coat, and his face composed into an expression that admitted nothing. Cecily noticed him approximately 4 seconds after Annalise did. "Edmund Vane," she said, in the tone she reserved for persons of consequence. "Crestwood. No heir, no attachment, and the house alone is worth 30,000 a year. Miss Finch has been positioned very deliberately, you see, near Lady Dorothea. It is practically arranged already." She let her fan fall half open. "Not that it concerns you." The dismissal was so practiced it barely left a mark. Annalise had been absorbing Cecily's assessments for 23 years and had developed a kind of interior stillness in response to them, a place she could retreat to where the words arrived but did not lodge. She watched the Duke turn slightly from the glass and caught, for a moment, a clear view of his face. He was looking at her. She looked away. He had been surveying the room. That was all. It was not, as it happened, all. But Annalise could not have known this and would not have believed it if she had been told. The estate grounds offered little occasion for encounter in the ordinary run of a morning, but the season at Ashford Hall was organized around a pattern of shared breakfasts, afternoon rides, and drawing-room gatherings that produced proximity whether the parties desired it or not. It was on the third morning, when Annalise had come out to the kitchen garden to find an hour of quiet before Cecily required the carriage, that Edmund appeared on the path from the stables with mud at his boots and a sheaf of folded papers under one arm, apparently on his way to speak with the groundsman about a drainage matter near the eastern wall. He stopped when he saw her. She stood among the frost-stiffened rosemary and waited for him to pass, because there was nothing else to do, and because standing quietly in inconvenient places was one of the competencies she had developed over the course of a life spent in margins. He did not pass. He inclined his head and said, "Miss Hartley." She had not realized he knew her name. She managed a correct curtsy and said, "Your Grace." And then, because the silence stretched, and she had not yet learned to fill silences with the kind of social noise that made people comfortable, she said nothing further. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not parse. It was not the polite indifference most of the room offered her, but neither was it anything she could name with confidence. He said, "The garden is better in the morning." And then he walked on toward the eastern wall. Annalise stood among the rosemary, and thought that perhaps he had simply been making a remark about the light. He had not been making a remark about the light. He had been back in that garden the following morning, and the morning after that. And on neither occasion had he needed to pass through it for any purpose she could identify. On the second of those mornings he had asked her, with the same short, level formality, whether she had read anything in Sir Henry's library worth the trouble. She had answered honestly, which surprised her even as she did it, naming the natural history volume she had found on the lower shelf and the survey of the Cornish coast that was better than it had any right to be. He had listened without the faint glaze that most conversations about books produced in this company. He had said, "The Cornish survey is reliable. The author walked every mile of it." And then the groundsman had appeared, and the conversation had ended, but the fact of it remained. Lady Dorothea Vane had descended on Ashford Hall on the 6th day of the season, with the composure of a general occupying familiar ground. She was Edmund's mother by marriage, the former Duchess, a woman in her late 50s, whose social authority had been accumulated across 3 decades of careful placement. She arrived with Margaret Finch at her right hand, a girl of 20, whose fair coloring and substantial portion had been selected with the precision of a jeweler matching stones, and she settled herself in Mrs. Pendleton's drawing room for the afternoon tea, with the air of someone arranging a room she already considered her own. Cecily had angled for an introduction and received one, and sat 3 chairs from Lady Dorothea in the kind of attentive posture that communicated social aspiration clearly enough to be useful, and quietly enough to avoid ridicule. Annalise sat beside her, holding a cup of tea she did not want. Wearing the gray wool that Cecily had told her twice that morning was the most appropriate dress she owned for a visit of this kind. Lady Dorothea glanced at her once, and then returned her attention to Cecily. "Your sister," she said to Cecily, not to Annalise. "She is younger?" 3 years, Cecily said. "She has not yet had a season." The particular emphasis on yet communicated, without stating it. That the yet was perhaps optimistic. Lady Dorothea arranged her fan. Quite. She turned the full warmth of her attention back to Cecily, and to the topic of Margaret Finch's accomplishments, and Annalise became again what she was accustomed to being in rooms of this kind, present without being seen, the negative space around which the actual composition was arranged. It was that same afternoon, when the tea had ended and the guests were collecting their wraps, that Cecily paused near Lady Dorothea's chair and said, in a voice pitched just low enough to suggest privacy and just high enough to carry 3 chairs in each direction, "My sister is a good-hearted girl, but one does not want to raise expectations where none are warranted. She is not the sort that men choose, you understand. One hopes she can be settled in some quiet way, eventually." Lady Dorothea heard it. Margaret Finch heard it. Mrs. Pendleton heard it, and looked at her cup. Annalise heard it, and did not move, because she had learned that movement was how witnesses knew where to look, and she did not intend to provide them with that particular assistance. She did not know that Edmund heard it too. He had come to collect his mother for the carriage, and was standing in the corridor doorway when Cecily's voice carried across the diminishing noise of departure. His face, when she did not look at him, did something she would never know to read. He crossed to his mother's chair in 4 even strides and offered his arm, and did not look at Cecily again. What she could not have known was that the clause "she will not have been chosen" had landed in him like a stone into still water, and that he was still feeling the rings of it when the carriage moved away. 3 days after the drawing-room tea, a Tuesday, with the grounds under an early frost that made the gravel paths ring, Annalise was lost. She had taken a wrong passage inside Ashford Hall while looking for the room where Mrs. Oakes, the head housekeeper, had told her the morning correspondence was laid, and had found herself instead in the servants' corridor that ran behind the East Wing's morning rooms. It was a plain, whitewashed passage, warmer than the staterooms for the reason that the kitchen heat reached it more readily, and it was there that she found the source of the soft sound she had been half-registering for the past 4 minutes, a child of perhaps 5 years, sitting on a small wooden step-stool beside a linen cupboard, with one bandaged hand held carefully in her lap, and a face arranged in the determined not-crying expression of someone who had already cried quite a lot, and was not prepared to do more. Annalise stopped. She looked at the child. The child looked at her. "Does it hurt very much?" Annalise asked. "Only when I forget not to hold it wrong," the child said. Annalise sat on the floor beside the step-stool, which was not a thing one did in a borrowed gown in a great house, and took from her pocket the small volume she had been carrying for 3 days, a natural history of garden birds, and opened it to a passage about the wren. She read aloud, slowly, and the child stopped holding herself quite so carefully. And by the time Mrs. Oakes appeared at the far end of the corridor with a tray of boiled barley water, the child had leaned against Annalise's arm and closed her eyes. Mrs. Oakes stood very still for a moment. Then she set the tray on the shelf beside her and said, "My granddaughter, miss. She caught her hand in the garden gate yesterday. I hope she has not been a trouble." "No trouble," Annalise said, and meant it. She did not hear the soft sound behind her. She did not know that the footstep at the far end of the corridor, the almost silent one that stopped and did not advance, belonged to Edmund, who had come through the service passage looking for the groundsman's report he had mislaid, and who had stood in the shadows of the linen cupboard doorway for the better part of 3 minutes, watching a woman in a gray wool gown sit on a stone floor and read to a child she did not know. He left before she turned, but Mrs. Oakes, whose business it was to know where people were in her house, had seen him there. She did not say so then. She filed the knowledge away in the same careful mental ledger, where she kept every other thing that might one day matter. If Annalise felt, in the days that followed, that the morning garden encounters had shifted in some quality she could not quite name, she attributed the feeling to imagination. He was still brief. He still asked his questions in the short, level sentences she had come to recognize as his particular register. He still issued the small, precise commands that she read as cold, and that she was slowly, very slowly, beginning to wonder if she had been reading correctly. "Come inside," he had said. When the frost came back on Thursday, and she was still in the garden without a mantle. "Sit down," he had said, when she had been standing for an hour in the Ashford Library cataloging the lower shelves at Sir Henry's oblique request, and Edmund had come in and seen that no chair had been provided. "Eat something," he had said on Saturday, so quietly she almost did not hear it, when she had stood through the full luncheon without a plate because Cecily had taken the last seat and there had been no graceful way to ask. She ate something. She did not understand why the instruction reached her the way it did, settling into her chest like a banked fire. She thought of his face in the corridor doorway. She thought of the way he had looked at her in the drawing room. Not through her, as most of the room did, but at her, specifically, as though she occupied the center of whatever space she stood in rather than the margins. She thought of these things, and then, because she was her father's daughter, and had been taught to be precise about the things she could and could not afford to believe, she reminded herself that a duke did not choose a woman with a hand-me-down gown and a borrowed season, and that Cecily was right, which Cecily always was about these things, and that a feeling of being seen was not the same as being chosen, and that the difference between those two things was the entire distance between her life as it was and her life as it could not be. She had not reckoned with the portrait. She found out about it by accident, in the way that most important things are found out in great houses, by being in the wrong corridor at the right time, and overhearing what was not meant for her. The young footman, Thomas, was speaking to a parlor-maid named Bess in the East Passage, and his voice carried. He was saying that His Grace had been in the East Gallery again, standing in front of the wall where the portrait used to hang, which was now only wall, because His Grace had had the portrait of the late Duchess turned to face the plaster 4 years ago and had never had it moved back, and that Mrs. Oakes said he stood there sometimes as though he was reading something in the blank wall that no one else could see. Annalise walked to the library and stood among the lower shelves and understood, with a precision that surprised her, what 4 years of standing in front of a blank wall meant. The late Duchess of Crestwood had died in the same winter he had inherited the title, which meant he had been 27 years old and had lost in the space of a single season both his father and his wife, and had become a duke in the middle of that loss, and had been standing inside that loss ever since with the face of a man who believed that stillness was the only available form of grace. He was not cold. He had learned to be still because the alternative was to be destroyed in public, and he was a man to whom public destruction was simply not permitted. She understood this, and understanding it, she felt something shift in her regard for him that she did not have a name for, and did not try to find one. The world, of course, was not interested in her understanding. The world, in the specific person of Lady Dorothea Vane, was moving along a track it had laid some time before Annalise had arrived at Ashford Hall, and the week that followed made the direction of that track unmistakable. The Dowager had been seen in conference with Sir Henry 3 separate mornings. Margaret Finch had been positioned near Edmund at every gathering with a consistency that could not be accidental. Lady Dorothea had spoken warmly of the Finch family's Cumberland estate, the girl's musical education, her temperament. Twice within Annalise's hearing, and once within Edmund's, and the clarity of Lady Dorothea's intentions was of the kind that required no decoding. Edmund, for his part, received these arrangements with the same level stillness he applied to everything else. He said what was required at dinners. He handed Margaret Finch into a carriage on Wednesday with the correct degree of courtesy. He was seen in conversation with the Dowager for 20 minutes on Thursday afternoon in the Rose Garden, and Annalise, who happened to be returning from the walled garden with a cutting she had been given by the under-gardener, turned back along the gravel path so as not to interrupt them, which cost her a longer walk and an additional hour. Before Cecily noticed she was late, and said something about it. She had been back in her room for 10 minutes when she heard Cecily in the corridor, speaking to Mrs. Pendleton, and her name surfacing in it, which it did occasionally in the way of a stone working its way up through field soil, persistent, unwanted, and not easily reburied. "One can see she has fancied herself noticed," Cecily was saying. "It is a little pathetic. Men like Crestwood do not notice women like Annalise. He is civil because he is civil to everyone, and she has mistaken civility for attention. It is the sort of confusion that happens when a girl has had no proper experience of society." A pause. A small, settled sound. "I shall have to speak to her about it before she embarrasses us both." Mrs. Pendleton said something indistinct. Cecily said, "She will understand eventually. She always does." Annalise sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the cutting she was still holding, a small sprig of rosemary she had been given because she had admired it, and the under-gardener had been kind, and she placed it in the glass of water on her nightstand, and told herself that Cecily was not wrong, and that she had known from the beginning of the season that she was the margin, not the composition, and that knowing a thing was the only honest protection against being made a fool of by it. She sat with this until she was sure of it. Then she dressed for the evening. The evening in question was the second ball of the season, held again at Ashford Hall, with a larger attendance than the first, the guest count having grown as the fortnight advanced to somewhere near 60. The rooms were lit with more candles than Annalise had ever been in the same space with at once, and the smell of hot wax and hothouse flowers and the specific warmth of many bodies in formal dress was the smell, she thought, of every important thing that would happen to other people while she watched. Cecily had arranged her in the gray wool again. There had been a brief conversation about the pale blue satin, which had been retrimmed twice and was beginning to show the evidence of it at the hem, and Cecily had weighed the options with the dispassion of a woman considering a hand of cards, and concluded that the gray, though plain, was at least unimpeachable, and that Annalise should not court notice on an evening when notice would not serve anyone. Annalise wore the gray. She stood at the edge of the floor, near the third pillar from the east windows, and watched the room arrange itself with the practiced efficiency of a mechanism that had been running this particular pattern for generations. Lady Dorothea was already seated near the far wall, Margaret Finch arranged at her right with a precision that left no ambiguity about the dowager's intended composition. Edmund stood near the top of the room, speaking to Sir Henry with the short, level attention he gave to all such conversations, and though he did not look toward the third pillar from the east windows, there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested an awareness of the room beyond his immediate sightline. This was the kind of thing Annalise had learned not to read into. She had been reading things correctly for 23 years, and she was not going to stop now on the basis of a set of shoulders. Cecily found her at the third pillar around 9 o'clock, when the second set had just ended, and the floor was in that brief reconfiguration between dances that allows for the kind of conversation that is not quite private and not quite public. She had been speaking to Lady Dorothea, which had clearly gone well, because her color was high, and her fan was moving with the rhythm of social satisfaction. She stopped beside Annalise. She did not look at her directly. which was how she delivered the things she intended to land cleanly without the inconvenience of a response. She said, in the voice she had used in the drawing room, the one pitched to carry 3 positions in each direction, "You have been very patient this season. I will grant you that. But patience is not the same as hope, and I think you must know, after these weeks, that you have been deluding yourself. A man like Crestwood, in a room like this, does not cross the floor for a woman like you. He never did. He never will. Come and sit with Mrs. Pendleton. It is warmer by the fire, and there is no use standing here pretending." The floor did what floors do when a verdict is delivered publicly, and everyone present is well trained enough not to stare. It simply emptied, by increments, the way water finds its level, until the space around Annalise was wider than it had been, and the 3rd pillar from the east windows had become a small, precise island. 2 women near the refreshment table did not quite look away quickly enough. A young man she had danced with once, a Mr. Carew, turned to his companion and said something she could not hear. Mrs. Pendleton, at the fire, looked toward her with an expression of uncomfortable sympathy that was, in its own way, another verdict. Annalise held her fan at a measured height. She looked at her sister. She was standing in the margin, as she had been standing in margins her entire life. But something had moved in her tonight that did not have the quality of endurance. It had the quality, instead, of a woman who has carried a weight for a very long time and has finally decided to set it down, not because the weight was gone, but because she was done pretending it was not there. She said, clearly and without elevation, "I think you believe what you say, Cecily. I think you have always believed it. I am sorry it has been so necessary." Cecily blinked. She had not expected a sentence. She had expected the familiar interior retreat, the stillness that could be read as acquiescence. And this was not that. She opened her mouth. The floor shifted. Not the actual floor, though in Annalise's recollection, later, it would always carry that quality, as though something structural had adjusted. What shifted was the room's attention, the way 60 people in a candle-lit ballroom turned, by degrees, toward a single point of motion. Edmund Vane, the Duke of Crestwood, had left the top of the room. He was crossing the floor. He walked with the same measured stride that he applied to the kitchen garden and the estate passages and the corridors of great houses, but he was walking toward the 3rd pillar from the east windows, toward the island of widened space and plain gray wool, with the particular quality of attention that the room recognized, even if Annalise had not yet been able to name it, as intention. The orchestra, which had been about to begin the next set, did not begin. The first violin held his bow and waited, the way musicians do when something more important than music is occurring in the room they serve. Lady Dorothea's fan stopped moving. Her gaze, which had been directed at her own composition near the far wall, moved to Edmund's back with an expression that no one could have called anything other than the recognition of displacement. She had built her calculation on a certainty, and the certainty was currently crossing a ballroom floor in the opposite direction from where she had placed it, and there was nothing in her considerable arsenal that applied to this particular development. Margaret Finch, to her considerable credit, said nothing. She sat with her hands folded and watched, and her face settled into something that was not quite composure and not quite surprise, but was, perhaps, a young woman understanding that she had been a piece in someone else's arrangement, and that the arrangement had now been concluded. Edmund stopped in front of Annalise. He was close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes, the color of river water in November, and the way his jaw was set. Not with coldness. She understood now, not with coldness at all, but with the specific held quality of a man who has been careful for 4 years and is choosing, in this moment, in front of these people, to stop. He looked at Cecily. He said, in the level, declarative voice he used for things that were not under discussion, "I believe you have mistaken the situation." He looked at Annalise. He said, "Miss Hartley." Not the cool form, not the distancing form. Simply her name, spoken as though it were the beginning of something rather than the end. He held out his hand. The room did not breathe. Annalise looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought of the kitchen garden and the Cornish survey and the blank wall where the portrait used to hang, and she thought of the small question he had asked her 3 days ago in the library, the one she had been turning over ever since. "Do you find the house very changed from when you arrived?" She had thought it a social question then. She understood now what it had been. She placed her hand in his. He led her onto the floor, and the orchestra, receiving the signal that music was now required, began. Mrs. Oakes was standing near the service door at the east side of the room. She had come through on a household matter and had not intended to remain, but she had stayed, because she was a woman who knew when something important was occurring, and who understood that witnessing was not the same as intruding. She watched the Duke of Crestwood dance with Annalise Hartley, and she pressed her lips together in a way that was not quite a smile, and then she went back through the service door to attend to her proper business. Cecily stood at the third pillar from the east windows for a moment longer. Then she went to sit with Mrs. Pendleton by the fire, and the space around the pillar closed again, and the floor returned to its ordinary traffic, and the evening continued. Lady Dorothea departed within the hour. She did not make a scene, because she was not a woman who made scenes, and because there was a dignity in the departure of a wrong calculation, if it was performed with sufficient composure. She told Sir Henry she had the beginnings of a headache, collected her shawl and her granddaughter-in-law that was not, and had the carriage brought around. Edmund was informed of her departure when the dance ended. He inclined his head toward the footman and returned his attention to Annalise without alteration. Later, when the ball had thinned and the candles had burned to their lower stations, they stood together in the east corridor that looked out over the grounds. And the frost was back on the lawns, and the window glass carried a thin line of silver, where the cold met the warm interior air. He told her about the portrait. He did not offer it as a confession or as an explanation, but as a fact he had decided she was permitted to have. He said that Catherine had died 4 years ago in November, that she had been 24 years old, that he had believed for a very long time that keeping still was the only way to be certain he would not become something he could not recognize, and that he was not entirely sure he had been wrong about that, and that he was also not sure, standing here at this specific window on this specific evening, that the stillness had been serving the purpose he had assigned to it. Annalise listened. When he was finished, she said, "I think the still things carry the most weight. I think that is why they stay still. It is not absence. It is accumulated gravity." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Yes." And then, because he was a man who had learned to say the necessary thing in the smallest number of words that would carry it, "You should know that I have spoken with Sir Henry about arranging a further visit to Crestwood, and that I intend to make that invitation one you have reason to accept," she said. "Your Grace." He said, "Edmund." She said nothing, because nothing was required, and because she was, in that moment, very full of things she was not yet ready to say aloud, but intended, in time, to say. The visit to Crestwood was arranged. The invitation was one she had reason to accept. She arrived at the great house on a Thursday in late November, when the grounds were under their first real snow, a fine dry snow that settled on the stone balustrades like powdered chalk and made the windows of the house glow amber against the white of the park. Edmund was on the steps when the carriage came up the drive, which was not, as she understood it, his customary practice. He handed her down with the same brevity he applied to everything, and said that Mrs. Oakes had asked after her, which was how she learned that Mrs. Oakes had been known here long before Annalise had any connection to Crestwood, that the house and the woman were of a piece in the way that only happens when both have survived the same long winters. Mrs. Oakes was in the entrance hall. She curtsied, correctly and without theater, and said in the plain way of someone who had been waiting an appropriate amount of time to say a specific thing, "We are glad to have you, Miss Hartley. The house has been ready for some time." Annalise understood that this was not only about the house. The East Gallery was reached on the second evening, not by arrangement but by the natural course of a household showing itself to someone who might be learning its geography. Edmund walked with her through the staterooms, naming them in the brief way he had, and when they reached the East Gallery, he stopped at the far wall without saying anything, and she saw the blank wall where the portrait had been, the slightly darker rectangle of plaster that marked where a frame had hung for some years before being removed. She did not comment on it. She stood beside him and let the silence be what it was, which was not empty. In the morning, she found a small painted miniature on the writing desk in the library, propped against the inkstand where she would see it when she sat down. It was a portrait of a woman she did not recognize, small and carefully executed, with the particular quality of a painting made with attention rather than commission. A note was folded beneath it in Edmund's handwriting, which was extremely spare, and said only, "I had this made from a sketch in the autumn. I would like it to have a proper place. I thought you might have a view on where." The woman in the miniature was wearing a gray wool dress. She sat with the miniature for a long time. Then she carried it through the east corridor and stood in the gallery and looked at the blank wall and at the slightly darker rectangle and at the winter light coming through the high windows, and she thought about what it meant to replace something with something else, and whether that was a diminishment or a restoration. And she decided it was neither. It was a choice. It was simply a choice. She placed the miniature on the ledge beneath the wall and went to find Edmund. He was in the library, standing at the window that looked over the park, watching the snow come down in the particular focused way he had of attending to things. She told him she had found a place for it. She told him where. He turned from the window and looked at her, and the held quality that she had once read as coldness and had long since learned to read correctly moved in his face and settled into something that was simply, unmistakably, him. "Here," he said, which was not a remark about the library. "Yes," she said, which was not a remark about the miniature. The fire was still going in the hearth behind her. The snow was still coming down outside the window. The park lay white and patient and enormous beyond the glass, belonging to no one in particular, and available, in the way that fields under snow are always available, to anyone willing to stand still long enough to see it. The miniature of Annalise Hartley, 23 years old, in a gray wool dress, in a Regency season, not the most fashionable girl in any room she had ever stood in, would hang in the East Gallery of Crestwood by Christmas. The blank wall would be blank no longer, and what replaced the blankness was not the portrait that had been there before, was not a record of what had been lost, but a small and specific image of what had been found. A woman reading to a child in a corridor, rendered in paint by a man who had been watching from the shadows and had understood, from that moment forward, that something in him had shifted and would not shift back. She stayed at Crestwood. In the weeks that followed, she learned the house the way one learns a house that is becoming one's own, by the progression of light across its floors at different hours, by the particular sound the east corridor made in a wind from the north, by the names of the stable lads and the cook's preferred flour, and the room that got cold in the afternoon when the sun moved around the south face. She learned Mrs. Oakes's granddaughter's name, which was Clara, and that Clara's hand was healing well, and that Clara had developed an interest in garden birds on the basis of a natural history volume that had subsequently gone missing from the library and been discovered, with the practiced innocence of a 5-year-old, under Clara's cot in the servants' quarters. Annalise left it there. Edmund learned, in the same weeks, the particular quality of her attention, which was the kind that did not require filling. He learned that she could sit in a room with him while he read his estate correspondence without making demands on the silence, and that this was, in ways he had not anticipated needing to name, one of the rarest things he had ever been given. He learned that she was capable of being precisely honest in moments when other people would have been kind instead, and that this was not unkindness but a form of respect that very few people had offered him since Catherine died and the world had learned to walk carefully around his grief. The grief did not go. It settled. It became the kind of thing a person carries not as a wound, but as a weight they have learned to distribute. Present in every step, but no longer determining where the steps could go. The portrait of the late Duchess would be given a proper place, he told her one evening, in a room that was not the East Gallery, in a place that honored what she had been, rather than what he had failed to be for her. He said this as he said most things, briefly and exactly, and Annalise received it the way she received everything he gave her. With the full attention he had always, from the very first morning in the kitchen garden, understood to be her most exact quality, she received him in return. And in this way, in the slow, procedural manner of all true things, the season that had begun with a woman standing in a borrowed gown at the edge of a ballroom floor, holding a fan at a measured height and waiting to be invisible, became instead the season in which she was seen by the one person in the room whose seeing would reorder the rest. If you have found yourself moved by Annalise's quiet courage, or by the Duke's long journey from stillness to choice, leave a word in the comments. Stories like hers are worth carrying forward, and knowing which moment stayed with you makes it possible to find others worth telling. The fire burned in the hearth at Crestwood that Christmas. Snow fell on the park outside the library window. Somewhere in the East Gallery, a small painted miniature of a woman in gray wool caught the last of the afternoon light, and the wall behind it held its new weight without complaint, and the house was warm.